So a little bit about Culture Declares Emergency. We are a growing global community of arts and culture champions declaring a climate and ecological emergency. The crisis compels us to imagine new possibilities and to propose systemic change. Our vision is that the UK cultural sector declares and takes action on the climate and ecological emergency. Our mission is to grow and support a diverse community of cultural sector declarers. And the values are to tell the truth, take action, and seek justice in the face of the emergency. So Culture Declares offers an online toolkit to inspire and support pledges, declaration announcements, and follow-up actions. We have designed kite marks, banner leaflets, and such designs. And there is also community networking on social media and in events for declarers to share, grow, and learn. So since its launch in April last year, over 1,000 individuals and organizations have declared an emergency through Culture Declares. If you haven't yet declared, please do and get in touch via our website, culturedeclares.org, and we can answer any questions you may have as well. So this growing network of culture declaring movements now includes music, architecture, heritage, health, and tourism, amongst others. And we work in solidarity with declaring movements globally to raise collective visibility and increase the urgency of our shared message. The offer is a response to the context of coronavirus and the devastating impact it has had on our society, and not least on the creative and cultural community. It is a space for anyone involved in or interested in a cultural response to the climate and ecological emergency to gather, to question, to share, and to support each other. It will be happening bi-weekly from July, starting on Wednesday, the 1st of July at 11 o'clock until 12:30, and with the opportunity for evening sessions too. And if anybody out there is interested in making an offer and leading a session, please get in touch at culturedeclares@gmail.com or via our social media. We welcome very much an open curatorship on this. On Wednesday, the 10th of June, last week, Culture Declares presented its strategy for 2020 for powerful, resilient, and networked movement building. And we'd like to thank all of those who attended and for the enthusiastic response and for all the input over the last few months. So going forward, as of next week, we have 3 working groups that are being established: strategic change making, action and events, and communications. We will put the links up onto the chat. So the first meetings will take place at the times below: Tuesday the 23rd, June, 9 until 10:30, strategic change making; Wednesday the 24th of June, 9 till 10:30 a.m. communications; and Thursday 25th of June, 9 till 10:30 actions and events. If you have a particular kind of feeling about one of those, or particular expertise or professional engagement, please come along and share and join. Where, you know, we are the sum of our parts, and everybody's input is very welcome and very gratefully received. So the groups are in place for you to connect with others, share your ideas, skills, and passion, and be supported to take action. So we will put up the registrations for those. The creative and cultural community deal with the art of the possible. Collectively, we can influence more just and sustainable ways of being, doing, and thinking. Your involvement, however big or small, is valuable and essential. And at that moment, I'd like to thank you all very much for being here. And I'd like to introduce Sara Campbell. She's the Assistant Director of Art and Culture at the University of Exeter, and she will introduce the speakers for tonight's programme. Thank you very much. Hi, Sara.
Hi, sorry for the delay there. I must say I'm a little bit surprised because I was expecting Misha to do all of our welcomes this evening, so apologies for being a little bit on the back foot. So, Misha Curson is the Contemporary Art Curator at the Eden Project, and this partnership for the event today came up. It's a collaboration between the Eden Project and the Environment and Sustainability Institute that's part of the University of Exeter in Penryn. And so Misha will be guiding the talk between our two speakers, Sara Bowler and Bram Thomas Arnold, who will both have, will speak about their practice. There'll be a performance, and we'll have opportunities for breakouts as well. So I hope I've covered everything. If I can hand over to Misha.
So welcome back to those who joined this morning's session. And for those who missed it, there is going to be a recording shared on the Culture Declares YouTube channel, so please do look that up. Today we're meeting in a virtual space, and the event was actually originally planned to take place in physical space this spring in Cornwall, which was cancelled due to COVID-19. So I want to say a big thank you to Culture Declares for helping us reimagine the event and giving us the opportunity to share it with a global audience. We had people joining us this morning from Singapore and France, which was wonderful. The original framing was a conversation about art and ecology in a time of ecological emergency. And now this sense of emergency is heightened by the pandemic and by global BLM protests. We have an awareness that all of these things are interconnected, and that there's an urgency around the need for effective cultural and ecological ethics and politics. This event was originally conceived across two Cornish collaborators, the Eden Project and the Environment and Sustainability Institute at the University of Exeter's campus in Penryn, Cornwall. Both Eden and the ESI have brought together different kinds of expertise, perspectives related to today's conversations. ESI is an interdisciplinary research institute focused on problems of environmental change. Academics at the ESI led the university's climate emergency response and are currently involved in regional conversations about a green post-COVID recovery. ASI has 7 years experience hosting art science exchanges as part of the University Arts and Culture programme. And Eden has been working together with Exeter since 2014. Eden, many of you will probably know, is a well-known and is a celebration of plants, ecology and community. We're set in a reclaimed post-industrial China clay pit, and we aim to embed culture across Eden's activities, to work closely with grassroots communities and community programs and world-leading artists and scientists, to encourage creative practice and critical thought, and to share human reflections on ecological priorities of climate, biodiversity, extinction, and their civic consequences. This evening, we will be hearing from two artists, both based in Cornwall, who've worked across both Eden and ESI. Bram Thomas Arnold is an artist and pedestrian, a writer who started walking and kept on going into drawing, performance, writing, broadcasting, and academia, completing a practice-based PhD in walking, writing and performance with Falmouth University and the University of the Arts London in 2016. He is currently Associate Lecturer in Fine Art at Falmouth University and a practicing artist. Bram's transdisciplinary practice has seen him build a piece of road in a forest, learn to translate Lithuanian, carry 60 English novels to New York, and set out to walk from London to the place of his birth in Switzerland. His work has been exhibited broadly in the UK and internationally. He also works under the moniker Trail Mix ED, producing audio works for broadcast in collaboration with partners including Resonance FM, the University of Exeter, Creative Scotland, London Fieldworks, and Cambridge University Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Bram has spent much of lockdown working with Dr. Lauren Holt at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge University on an exploration of the existential risks of biodiversity loss. Sara Bowler is an artist also based in Cornwall. She investigates the palimpsest of place and how evidence of former use and occupation resonates through time. She is drawn to everyday locations, hedge-bound fields, old buildings, tracks in the land, curious about their histories and how they link to the past. She's curious about the impact of human agency on the land and how over millennia people have used, shaped, changed and regarded it. the evidence that remains in archaeological and historical accounts reflects people's energy, commitment, and innovation, as well as their capacity for distraction and regeneration. She will talk to us this evening about Goonhilly Village Green #2, an experimental cross-disciplinary project devised by Sara in collaboration with artist Elizabeth Masterson and co-produced with curators Field Notes and Amy Brocklehurst in 2019. The project brought people to Goonhilly Downs in Cornwall to explore a unique place through a series of artist-led events and activities. So I've invited Sara and Bram to respond to a set of questions in whatever capacity they creatively wish. And the first questions that we're going to explore include: how can contemporary art practice open up social, ecological, and geological perspectives on landscape and place? And as artists making work in rural Cornwall, how do local geographies and communities inform and sustain your personal artistic practice? So I'm now going to hand over to Sara.
We can hear you, Sara.
Great, good, thank you. Thank you, Misha, and to Culture Declares for the introductions, and to those joining. I want to take you through the project Goonhilly Village Green that was delivered in 2019. It drew on various bodies and forms of knowledge, creating an experimental, experiential and temporary commons on Goonhilly Downs on the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall. It was cross-disciplinary, rooted in place, devised by artists and curators, and built on a pilot in 2015, which my colleague and co-director of Goonhilly Village Green, Elizabeth Masterson, and I developed during time spent as Creative Fellows at the Environment and Sustainability Institute at Exeter University's Cornwall campus, under the guidance of Caitlin. We worked on Goonhilly Village Green 2 very closely with producers Field Notes. The programme included a community programme of talks and workshops which ran from January to March 2019 at various locations on the Lizard, a dedicated day for primary schools in the region, in the area, local area, a paid internship which was awarded to a young artist, Amy Brocklehurst, the mainly public event, The Gathering, which primarily I'll talk about shortly, an exhibition of documentation at the Museum of Cornish Life in Helston, a commission to the writer Rosanna Lowe to reflect on the artist's work, as well as, or alongside, 11 further artist commissions, all of whom had links to or are resident or were resident in Cornwall. And it formed underpinned the first contemporary art exhibition at Eden, curated by Misha in collaboration with Field Notes. So what is Goonhilly Downs? It's a high flat plateau underlain by rare serpentine rock, which supports unique flora and fauna. It's a site of special scientific interest and a national nature reserve. And Lizzie and I have worked there with Natural England land managers since 2006, presenting a series of Happy Drone projects, which consisted of artists' interventions and exhibitions. And I think it's quite important to say that that long-standing relationship we have with Natural England, built on trust, is really fundamental to making things like this happen. The site is also home to significant Neolithic and Bronze Age remains. This is the Dry Tree Standing Stone, which marks the confluence of 5 ancient parish boundaries and the highest point on the Downs. It's also home to Goonhilly Earth Station Limited. You can see one of its dishes there in the background, that has grown out of the UK's very first satellite Earth station, begun in 1961 by the then GPO, to deliver the first live televised broadcast from America via the early Telstar satellite, and perhaps even more famously in 1969 to broadcast the moon landings.
Sarah, you're not screen sharing yet. Sorry to interrupt, but you have to share your screen.
Oh dear, that's not good. What have I done? Oh, thank you. So sorry, everyone. Is that working now?
Yeah, you just need to go into slideshow. That's fine.
Lovely. Thank you. So sorry. So the site spans over 6,000 years of human intervention. And as people haven't seen the first images, this is a quick shot of Goonhilly Downs. And this is my opening slide. Just shunt back. It's also home to some abandoned crofts. It's very difficult to grow anything on Goonhilly Downs because of the serpentine rock. And the remnants of RAF Dry Tree, one of Britain's original home chain radar stations deployed during World War II. Very little remains, but a few buildings are extant. It's also one of the most enigmatic places you can find yourself on a misty morning early in August. So it's quite a special place. So what was Goonhilly Village Green? Well, if you can imagine a village of artists holding a local fete on an imaginary village green, it'll give you some idea. There's never been a Goonhilly village, but the land was once part of a commons. And it all takes place in the presence of the technology that makes this online event happen today. So interesting conjunctions. The project developed as a durational engagement with the site and local organisations and businesses. 6 artists were commissioned with 5 organisations locally. So it was the Earth Station, Goonhilly Earth Station Limited, Natural England, Lizard Outreach Trust, the Museum of Cornish Life and Trellewarren Estate. Those artists were researching, discussing, exploring sites and resources to make new work. And 6 further artists made work for the main event in response to that main event. This image and the following one is the opening ceremony, which was created by Beth Emily Richards. It's called Welcome, in brackets, Sent Forever. She worked, developed a performance which was delivered by Hum, a choir based in nearby Penryn, and she researched the ancient May ritual of Floriday at Helston's Museum of Cornish Life, alongside additional research into a suitable design for an alien welcome mat, various symbols, harmonies, very much a cross-person, multiple-stranded project really that drew on a lot of contributions. So this ceremony involved singing, raising the mats, and performance from the Hum Choir on the opening of Goonhilly Village Green. The day included activities. This is a shot of Simon Baylis's Landscape Painters Anonymous that encouraged people to enjoy the simple pleasures of plein air painting directly in the landscape, just people sitting making watercolours. Things like archaeology tours. This one is led by Charlie Johns, a former Cornwall County archaeologist. So primarily Goonhilly Village Green was very much a celebration of a unique location. It encouraged people to experience the unexpected and venture into a landscape they might not previously have explored. It provided a platform for people to socialise, learn, explore and play, and attracted around 500 visitors throughout one glorious, calm, dry day on the Lizard. And for anyone who lives down here, you'll know how rare that is, but we were very fortunate. And it took them to parts of the area, parts of the Downs that they might have overlooked in favour of our rather more fabulous coasts, and invited them to consider place from multiple perspectives. So visitors here are listening to Bram's Cardinal Points, a pre-recorded radio show made specifically for the occasion, which was transmitted from 4 portable radios. While Raymond Oliver Barker created a room-sized portable camera obscura called Conduit to allow viewers to see outside from different perspectives. And my own piece, Thresholds, grew out of research into ancient boundaries between the Domesday-listed Trellewarren Estate and Goonhilly Downs, taking the Dry Trees marking of 5 ancient parish boundaries as its starting point. It involved a 5-speaker surround sound work featuring archival recordings of early satellites and Neil Armstrong on the moon, radio signals from space of lightning strikes on Earth, local field recordings, and 5 modulated frequencies based on perfect fifths. Rosanna Martin considered the Downs geology, creating the Lost Rock Library, made up of favoured rocks donated by subscribers, who provided a description and drawing, which were then lent to people on indefinite loan who were visiting on the day. There was a lecture and film programme delivered in what we call the Happydrome, a former radar receiver bunker. Here Paul Cheney is describing his research into an ongoing work, the Lizard Exit Plan, which envisions the peninsula as a self-sufficient entity and what its natural resources could sustain should it be cut off from the mainland through crisis or disaster, catastrophe. He presented 2 billboards on the Downs, mischievously suggesting to people that there would soon be new eco-homes available. So the gathering provided opportunities to explore, take part, meet. People talk, eat, drink, learn, relax. It was really very much a village fete with a difference. Here, a young visitor is inventing coded alphabets and writing telegrams to aliens. Phillida Blumel, another artist we work with, wrote and designed the Goonhilly Chronicle, providing her interpretations of the artist's works and a map to navigate the site. So this event happened, we had around 500 people, but we built up audiences over a 3-month period at the beginning of the year. This is a trip for artists and volunteer assistants to the usually off-limits Goonhilly Earth Station Limited, which was just absolutely fabulous. And again, Lizzie and I have built up a long-standing relationship with the people who work there over 10, 12 years, which makes all the difference when you're trying to put something like this together. And held talks in local venues. This is Beth Emily Richards talking about her work in research at the Museum of Cornish Life in Helston. And here we have on the left James Hankey, who was one of our commissioned artists working with Goonhilly Earth Station, working with a former BT satellite technologist, Robin Ridge, attempting to introduce the physics of waveforms to a predominantly artist audience. And they did struggle a bit because we couldn't understand what they were telling us. But we got there in the end and then got to play. So the whole idea was to realise waveforms in the space. This is a very dark space within the bunker. And using torches and long exposures, we were able to capture quite remarkable images. And here, Raymond Oliver Barker introduced us at the Trello Warren estate into building your own personal obscura, which subsequently were tested in the landscape. So the project really was a celebration and based on investigations of a very specific location, which has a very distinct history, but on first appearance might look fairly bland and not particularly interesting, and certainly not with the classic picturesque qualities that so much of Cornwall is imbued with. And I think the questions that I'd like to suggest now, which can feed into the breakout sessions, reflect thinking about that notion of this event in a very specific place. So my first question is, can we learn from the past? And if so, how can we implement the learning? It seems that there is a lot within historical and archaeological records, but I'm not convinced that the more contemporary ecological science necessarily considers that past learning, and I think there's some really rich seams to explore there. My second question is local projects for local participants, but is there a danger of nationalism, regionalism, localism creeping in? And if so, how can we avoid this? It seems, you know, we can do these things locally, but do they then become clannish? And is that is that something we need to avoid? And my final question is, we're all engaged in online and digital technologies, but how do we square the circle of the environmentally damning impact of the extractive industries that provide the metals, plastic and fuel to make and ship communication products, including the expanding array of satellite technology orbiting the Earth? So I think on that point, just to say thank you for watching, and to provide a couple of email addresses, and thanks to Arta Tixilixi, who took these amazing photos for us, to say thank you and to hand back to Misha.
So one thing that came up in my breakout session was the human perspective of language and literature, and how we're using the development of literature and development of writing has become a kind of block to the way in which we can read landscape and the way in which we can use, for example, gesture as a communication form. Zoe Quick is an artist who's making work in Wales. I wonder if you had anything to comment on that, Zoe.
I'm trying to think what further to add in there. And I'm fascinated by the way that, particularly because I'm learning Welsh, to try and find a way into understanding the landscape I'm working in, which I'm sort of, just the process of learning a language itself is kind of a really interesting one, because you find yourself toggling between your mother tongue and another, a sort of strange set of sounds in your mouth, actually. And I'm really conscious also that there's a kind of the time of language is quite interesting in that it holds phrases and metaphors and rhythms of languages which sort of match practices with the land from the past, which I think is really powerful as well. I'm kind of interested in the rhythms of language and the spoken language, which are subtly different to the way we read. But yes, what we were talking about just now was kind of about the more than human language. How is it we speak to, for me, for my project, a mountain? How do we converse or exchange with a mountain? What does that look like? And actually something I'm really interested in is the old Welsh ballads, which often were a conversation with a bird or a gorse bush or something, and they singing actually I think is something that's a really interesting form of language, which often isn't quite words, and has rhythms about it, and somehow relates to landscape. And in Welsh culture, I believe, anyone else can correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously there's a deep root of singing in Welsh culture, but there's a sense that through singing you can reach what they Anurvan, that the other world, which is kind of the more mythic realm, which I think is kind of a really interesting. There's something very visceral about singing that I think takes us sort of into our body and into a connection with the world in some way.
So from Lucy Frears, she said that herself, Gillian, Jessie and Chloe all discussed a few things, and she was the only one who knew the site, so gave some snippets of info about it. Points raised were about local. There's a challenge of getting people there, so how can it be anything else? So perhaps in response to that, Bram, I wonder if I could ask you to respond to this question of local projects for local participants, but is there a danger of nationalism, regionalism, or localism creeping in? And if so, how can we avoid this?
Yeah, I'm on, aren't I? My microphone, yes. Yeah, just to respond quickly to Zoe's little discussion of the Welsh language. I grew up in Wales, but I'm not Welsh. But there are some, I don't know, beautiful ideas about the Welsh language that I really enjoy. And it's sort of, because it's one of the oldest languages in Europe, and it has a really direct relationship to the landscape, because historically Welsh people they couldn't write. I don't know what the posh word for couldn't write is off the top of my head. But basically, so the landscape is, so the place names in Wales are descriptions of how to get there from other places, which is a rather beautiful thing. And Dylan Thomas once said something beautiful about the Welsh language and how it's been massively made by the landscape. So the language really speaks from the hills to the hills. So if you speak to the Welsh landscape in Welsh, you are speaking through thousands of years of mouths learning those hills and learning that shape in your mouth. It's very tricky language to learn. And so that does sort of come to the localism, nationalism issue, obviously, because so we're in Cornwall and there is this sort of, I don't know, whether anyone over the recent weeks has been on social media as much as I have, there's a sort of growing jokey campaign that might become serious about creating a Celtic nation that luckily cuts us off from the majority of England and sort of brings Cornwall and Wales and Scotland together. But sort of, yeah, the nationalist, localist agenda, sort of, I was in a breakout group with Verity and Tom, I believe, and Layla, and they're both archaeologists. I don't know whether they want to come in on this at some point. I think it's Tom Sewell is the chap in the chat. Yeah, and they were talking about how sort of historically the danger of engaging your local tendency does become a national identity, and that does lean towards nationalism quite quickly if you're not careful. So I think Verity's point was about bringing in as many voices into that conversation as possible to avoid that. And then Layla said something mad about an excavation in Leicester, which sort of has the potential to rewrite history because there are pre-Roman excavations happening in Leicester that change the landscape of who was in Britain at the time, apparently. But maybe if Layla or Tom Sewell want to come back in on either of those points, I'd be happy for that. They're definitely not experts, though, according to the thing. None of us are, Tom. It's fine.
We had a good point from Mike Pryor, who said, if rooted in a global movement, like Culture Declares, local collaboration and action can easily avoid these pitfalls, localism, etc.
Yeah, that's nice.
So maybe I could also revert back to one of Sarah's other questions, which is, we're all engaged in online and digital technologies, but how do we square the circle of the environmentally damning impact of the extractive industries that provide the metals, plastics and fuels to make and ship communication products, including the expanding array of satellite technology orbiting the Earth? And just to add to that, also, I think there's a kind of common misconception of the cloud as this ethereal thing, but actually the cloud are physical servers and they take huge amounts of energy to run. So every single photograph that we take and store on the cloud is a drain and has an environmental cost. So that's actually quite an important thing to bring it into a conversation where we're talking about having an environmental responsibility while engaging in a symposium via an internet platform. But I wonder if I could put that back to you and Sarah. I don't know who'd like to go first.
Sarah, do you want to go first on that?
I put the question, I don't have any answers, but I've been thinking about it. And I'm wondering if there's something, I mean, that may already exist in the right or the other circles, but is there something called digital hygiene? And maybe we could all, a friend, well, actually one of the producers, Rosie Allen from Field Notes, introduced me to the concept of really we should be deleting all those thousands of emails that we've never got around to sorting out. We just leave there because we think we might need them one day, because they are all sitting on a server somewhere which is consuming electricity, which needs to be cooled, and quite often increasingly are being put in pristine wilderness places because they're cold places or because they're remote, so less likely to be sabotaged. So I think that's one thing maybe we should think about, and maybe we need to push producers. I mean, I'm someone who uses Apple, and I like their products, but perhaps I have to be pushing them to make bolt-on things that mean I can have one machine that lasts 20 years, but I can upgrade it and not have to sort of think about how do I recycle this now. It just, I know the technology is moving on very quickly, but it feels that perhaps as users and consumers, we have more power than maybe we think. And perhaps we have to start pushing companies to do that. I mean, the same with vehicles, the same with all sorts of things that could really be more sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point with this question is none of us have any answers. And but the bringing of the question into the space is really important. It holds the risk of going down that sort of hypocritical finger pointing, sort of petty argument type of thing. But as you say, I think it's really important to consider our actions as individuals and collective sort of entities, if we are collective entities, if we can become collective entities. Yeah, I mean, sort of, there's an amazing book by the artist James Bridle who talks about a new dark age, and technology is the end of the future. And sort of in there he talks about how the ICT industry, the information computer technology industry, has as large a carbon footprint as the aviation industry. And that was prior to us all streaming Netflix constantly for 8 hours a day during lockdown. So it's kind of, and it's a really unseen aspect of our digital existences that are all our existences these days. And I constantly have the debate about whether I should depart Facebook, WhatsApp and Instagram and get rid of my smartphone and just have a Nokia again. And kind of, maybe I should, maybe I will. Maybe this will be the last time I ever join any of these platforms, but I'm not sure yet. I don't think any of us are sure yet because they're still useful. This is an amazing way to generate a local but dispersed community that we're still really experimenting with. And it's been an amazing weekly thing to join in with CDD and watch this sort of growing community tentatively try and figure out how to be together alone online. And that's such a nice sentence. I'm going to finish on that.
That's wonderful. And I guess, you know, working for an organisation like Eden, the past however many months that we've been working from home, 3 months, I mean, the reduction in my travel and even driving to and from work, let alone travelling across the country, it'd be interesting to understand the offset in if we had asked everyone to drive to Penryn to take part in this conversation compared to the environmental impact of hosting it via Zoom. Yeah. And then the broader impact that can be fostered through having a conversation with people who are based in Scotland and Wales and Cornwall and London and France and Singapore, perhaps has a bigger benefit than and outweighs that cost. But without talking too much on this, there will be an opportunity to come back and have more questions later on, but I'd like to hand over to Bram for his response to those two first questions.
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Misha. Good evening, everybody. How are you all doing? You okay out there? Yeah, good. Okay. Right. I'm just going to briefly say that in those first two questions, I think by the end of this, you might know whether I've answered them or not, but I'm not going to directly address them. I'm going to instead address the sort of subheading of this evening's event on the notion of sustaining practice. And so instead of just talking about sustaining practice, I thought I'd just fucking well do some. So basically, I am in a room with some headphones on, and very shortly I'm going to take those headphones off. When I take those headphones off, you can't talk to me anymore, and I can do whatever the hell I like until I've finished. And don't worry, it's going to be nice. It's a nice thing. But I'm not going to be able to hear you if I'm going wrong. So we've done a tech run through of this. It should be fine. There's so much technology in this room. We should all be dead. But basically, I'm going to take my headphones off right now, and I'm going to try and invite you into an experiment, which we'll hear more about in a moment. Okay, so welcome everybody. Initially, I must apologise to the audience because I am going to read from a script, but I must also apologise to the script because I am probably not going to stick to it. For example, that wasn't written on the script. Welcome to bibliotherapy for the Anthropocene. I mean bibliotherapy for the quarantine. Bibliotherapy for the Anthropocene is a reading group that's not really a reading group, but it is definitely something made up of two really long words and two really short ones. Anthropocene bibliotherapy for the quarantine. Yes, so this is bibliotherapy for the quarantine, and yes, I'm afraid it is a test, a live test. So yes, does everyone understand the words bibliotherapy and Anthropocene? Bibliotherapy. I need you to nod. Oh yeah, we've got hands, yeah. XR hands, cool. Okay, well anyway, Anthropocene, how are we doing on Anthropocene? We're nodding, growling, all right, anyway. You're going to get the introduction anyway, because this is a performance and I'm in charge. The Anthropocene, then, is a thought experiment and an indefatigable reality. It is the name now given to the geological epoch we are living, breathing in, and which we are sharing this digital space in. A geological epoch based on the idea that if in 3 billion years' time some foreign body were to land upon the Earth, they would see a categorical reference point for our society's existence in the fossil record, in the strata, in the great stone book of the Earth. And for anyone out there concerned about whether naming a geological epoch after the human race is a bit self-centered or a bit all-encompassing, try and remember that some of the white guys came up with all the names of all the other ones as well, and yes, it's problematic. Bibliotherapy then, re-emerging from its Greek roots into an NHS study in the early 2000s, bibliotherapy is the notion that a group of chronically or terminally ill patients like ourselves could come together each week and over the course of 6 months or so, read aloud a classic work of literature together. And by doing so, they would make physical and mental improvements in their well-being and the well-being of their environments. Bibliotherapy for the Anthropocene, I mean quarantine, is then a happening. A performance poetry session, if you like, a pastiche of a Quaker meeting and a reconvening of the Dead Poets Society in which a group of strangers, friends and human beings come together to read aloud and to sit in awkward silence. I'm reading aloud, you're sitting in awkward silence. To reflect and consider that you have, unbeknownst to you and without your consent, been roped into significantly changing the temporality of the planet. So much so that an alien being that I've already mentioned would be able to see the change our species has wrought upon the strata, but also in the depths of that, this alien being would find flints next to skyscrapers. It would not find a single trace of a particular me or a particular you in the geological record. Bibliotherapy for the quarantine, then, is a performance about language, by people, for the Anthropocene, for people and for non-human beings, for consideration and time, for being and being with. It is filled with awkward silences like this one. And unanticipated humour like this, for words are cheeky scamps and they can be seriously funny when you least expect them to. This place is not about pretending that we know what words mean, but about putting our hand up, but don't do that, I can't interrupt. About confessing to our own uncertainty and checking those words in a dictionary. There is no demand to read or to sit, merely a suggestion that to sit and to read and to listen is why many of you have come tonight. And reading aloud while we stumble, we will fall, we will fail, for we will encounter our uncertainty from a position of safety and comfort, hopefully between tea and biscuits. I trust you brought your own tea and biscuits. I've got chocolate eclairs. We will mispronounce words like bacteriocene, because these are not words one is designed to encounter, let alone read to strangers through Zoom on a Friday night, and because we are being recorded for reasons I am as yet unsure about. So, what is going on here? I am attempting to reconstruct a reading group that generally happens in a small space where we are together drinking the same tea and eating the same biscuits. There is a lectern at which I am stood, and there are other lecterns. There is a pile of texts, though you cannot see them, and I'm going to read some of them to you. There is an order to this madness, but not much of one. There is a microphone, a pencil, a dictionary and some post-it notes, and considerably less than all the time in the world because this is Zoom and everyone's on the screen so often we all hate it these days. And so this is a space in which we are attempting to allow the thought experiment of the Anthropocene to dwell amongst us in all its complexity and uncertainty. To realise we are the first beings to be able to acknowledge that we have unbeknownst to us and without our consent, being roped into significantly changing the temporality, the temperature, the climate, the presence, the disposition, the potential, and the potency of the planet we're all stood on. And so, before we begin, I would just like to lead us all in a short breathing exercise to ensure that we have, as far as is digitally possible, all arrived on the same cosmic plane, and to calm myself down as much as you. So I want you to breathe in for as long as it takes me to say this sentence, and breathe out for as long as it takes me to say this sentence. To breathe in for as long as it takes me to say this sentence, and breathe out for as long as it takes me to say this sentence. To breathe in for as long as it takes me to say this sentence, and breathe out for as long as it takes me to say this sentence. To breathe in for as long as it takes me to say this sentence, and breathe out for as long as it takes me to say this sentence. To breathe in for as long as it takes me to say this sentence, and to breathe out for as long as it takes me to say this sentence. Don't worry, I'm finished now. You can keep breathing. Don't die. Keep breathing. And just in case you're concerned that that exercise might have come from some sort of mindfulness for dummies type tone, don't worry. I want to reassure you that it is in fact from a London Underground tube advert for Vic's Vapor. So, founded as our little group is on the dream of the Dead Poets Society, here at Bibliotherapy for the Anthropocene, we do not read Thoreau at the beginning, but we do sometimes read it in the middle. Instead, we recite the immortal words of the 1960s itinerant polymath, the geodesic wizard, the utopian visionary, the ever-hopeful R. Spencer Fuller, who once said, "I know that I am not a category, a hybrid specialization. I am not a thing, and now I seem to be a bird, an evolutionary process, an integral function of the universe. And so are you." So, now we've finished the introduction, we can actually move on to the session of bibliotherapy for the quarantine, where we will be reading from Strata 1 shortly. This is a story we know, and this is a story we need to know. A story whereby industrial transformation turned out to be a bubble of promise, followed by lost livelihoods and damaged landscapes. And yet, such documents are not enough. If we end the story with decay, we abandon all hope, or turn our attention to other sites of promise and ruin, promise and ruin, promise and ruin, promise and ruin. And can you think of anything more uncanny than realizing that you are in a whole new geological period, one marked by humans becoming a geophysical force on a planetary scale? I looked humans up in the index of ecology from individuals to ecosystems the other day, but there is no entry for the human as a creature. There is only an entry for human activity. And it goes like this. carbon cycle perturbation, ecosystem health impact, estuarine nutrient inputs, fossil records, habitat restoration, lake nutrient budgets, management strategies, pressure states response, species invasion management, sustainability, terrestrial communities input. And it goes on like this for a while, but never once does it consider the human as a creature, as part of this. It goes on like this, a bit like a story a friend once told me, which forms the Mobius strip of a thing. A circle that once started seems impossible to escape, a loop which begins with those immortal lines. Once upon a time, there was a man sat in a cave with his son on a dark and stormy night, and his son turned to him and asked, "Dad, can you tell me a story?" And the old man turned to him and said, "Of course, son. Well, it starts like this. Once upon a time, there was a man sat in a cave with his son on a dark and stormy night, and his son turned to him and asked, 'Dad, can you tell me a story?' And the old man turned to him and said, 'Of course, son. Well, it starts like this. Once upon a time, there was a man sat in a cave on a dark and stormy night with his son.'" I read that line slightly in the wrong order because I wasn't looking. I'd lost track of it. But during this dark and stormy night, during which it was finally accepted that barbaric implosion cannot be entirely ruled out. And so, though I am grateful to the rock, though I know that I was made for it, I can tell from the sensation passed through the sole of my foot that we are having to develop new ways of thinking, and new ways of thinking in which we are still so terribly lost. For these ideas are so new, and our minds are so old. The outcomes of millennia spent in caves, sitting around fires, telling each other stories about once upon a time. Stories in which, over the last few decades, we have had to make room for a lot of new words in. Ecology, ecosystem, biosphere, symbiosis, Gaia, sustainable development, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Perfilocene, Gynocene, Pachamamacene, Novocene, Planetation, Zoocene, Homogenocene, Bacteriocene, Plasticine, and the rest. These are words that are framed to express a cooperative rather than a competitive relation with other life forms. For the form of being we exist within is a being that is with. A being that is inextricably linked to all other forms of being. And I know it's easy to say we don't need more high technologies inescapably dependent on despoilation of the earth, as I stand here and commune with you through my three very extracted technologies, the very extracted bodies that are so much of the problem. For here, in the midst of our orgy of being lords of creation, texting as we drive and zooming as we think, it's hard to put down the smartphone and stop looking for the next techno fix, and to ask the question, what is the appropriate technology for your kind of fun? What is the appropriate technology for your kind of fun? Appropriate technology is a term that used to be bandied about by the Green Movement, but has somehow fallen out of fashion. Under its definition, technology is pretty much anything that enables one to extend out from oneself and into the world. Language is the technology. A pencil is a technology. This piece of paper printed with characters from a machine is several different fucking layers of a technology. So what appropriate technology aims to simply suggest is that one needs to spend a little time considering the underlying purpose of one's activity before undertaking it, to discern what it is you really want to do, and how therefore might it best be done. The agrarian poet Wendell Berry wrote an article in the late 1990s entitled "Why I Will Not Buy a Computer," in which he highlighted that, in ecological terms, the most efficient and therefore the most appropriate technology for its writing would not be a computer. He goes on to point out the most appropriate technology would be his 1956 Royal Standard typewriter, followed presumably by his wife and presumably a computer, followed presumably sometime thereafter by Penguin, Random House and another computer, and subsequently the entire machinations
the globalised corporate grind of the publishing industry. But hey, who's counting, right? So, bibliotherapy for the quarantine is a proposition, and we would like to ask you this evening, what is the appropriate technology for your kind of fun? How do we move from lockdown and Netflix to the nearest cured Primark, searching for the next change of scene, the next holiday, the next desperate jolly, where we all oh so frequently travel as far as we can afford, merely to come into the peace of the wild things. We do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. We come into the presence of still water, some distant lake, and we feel above us the day-blind stars waiting with their light. And for a time, we rest in the grace of the world and are free.
Right, no going off stage, is there? Straight back on stage, the other stage. Hello, everyone. I'm going to drink a glass of water while you think about what you're doing.
Thank you very much, Bram. That was fantastic.
You're welcome.
So what I'd like to do now is pose the final question, which is, can art play a role in helping us reflect on our individual relationships and responsibilities to nature? And that question's to go to our audience and our artists. So I'd love for you all to think about that and comment in the chat stream. And also, if you'd like to come back in with further questions, then please do. But to give Bram a little bit of a break, perhaps we could go to Sara first to respond to this question. So to repeat it, it's, can art play a role in helping us reflect on our individual relationships and responsibilities to nature?
Yes, I think it can. That's it, yeah, I've answered it. I'm looking at the chat and there have been some people making comments, can't find them quite as quickly now, but suggesting that the work of artists can draw attention to all sorts of things, and that if those things are within the natural realm or our impact on the natural realm, then yes, I think art does have that capacity across the board. It doesn't have to just be visual art, it's all practices. I think there is something though where, particularly for contemporary practitioners, where we are not necessarily illustrating things that are happening within the natural world, we're responding to them. So those responses may not take the form of description or something identifiable. They're going to be processed internally by the individual and then represented or presented as a series or developed through the work, so that people have to some degree interpret it, take it back in. And it is a different form than perhaps people who are commissioned to respond to situations within the natural environment in a way that is immediately accessible. I sort of really applaud the rise of things like infographics when they're well used, because they're such a quick way of getting information over to people. But there are differences between the purpose of these different practices, and I think people have to be aware of that.
Definitely. Bram?
Yeah, I think maybe what I sort of want to say on this is sort of, there's, I think Caitlin asked the question in the little chat there, what is nature? And that then made me go, well, what is art if we're expecting art to resolve some sort of problem? And I think an interesting conflict in my practice is I'm attempting to sort of, I don't know, generate a form of ecological art practice, if you like, or an ecological form of subjectivity, is attempting to realize that I'm not an individual. I am the outcome of a series of collective responses generated over time. And the art world has a sort of, I don't know, historical, perhaps modern tendency to pretend that we're individual artists, whereas actually we are the outcome of networks and communities that are more than human as well as human. And that there's this real conflict between trying to be Bram Thomas Arnold, the artist who wants to do bibliotherapy for the quarantine, but realizing he needs some other humans and a shitload of technology to do it these days. And sort of trying to figure out where between the art world and the natural world, and they're all one world basically, we're all stood on one lump of rock right now. It's kind of, yeah, so can art play a role in our relationship to nature? Yes, it definitely can. But I think it can also, both those things, art and nature, those two really active words in that question, can be badly manipulated in the same way that archaeological histories can be badly manipulated by the alt-right to generate nationalistic tendencies amongst the local flora and fauna. I don't know. So yes, I'm into sort of diversifying the voices within the art world and probing the question of what the Anthropocene is and what might something that is for the Anthropocene be, and how you might sustain that as a form of practice when you can't come together in a small Quaker-like meeting in a cold room with some warm tea and talk about it.
We had a great comment from Tom Sewell. It's worth remembering that all art, like all life and all technology, exists within the natural world. And it's the artist's responsibility to consider their material use in terms of the things that they make. So I have another question here from Sarah Campbell. Is reflection a form of action?
Yes, I think so.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because you need to reflect before you act quite often, so that you can consider the implication of your actions. So I think reflection is very active. Even I can give you a lovely example of a friend of mine who wrote her PhD thesis and deliberately wanted to be in a practical studio environment while she did it. And some of the undergraduate students would talk to her and say, "What are you doing? You sit here every day, we can't really see what you're doing." And she said, "Oh, I'm writing." And they said, "Oh, you're not really doing anything then, are you?" Because there was no visible output other than pages. It wasn't classed as action, but obviously a huge amount of reflection and thinking before writing, which most people would regard as an action. So I think it was just their lack of experience that made them say that, but it was interesting. And she also discovered that sitting in a studio with eco lights, she had to wave her arms about every 10 minutes, otherwise the lights went out, because it was geared up for people moving around, being practical. So, interesting conundrums of trying to live an eco life. What do you think, Bram?
Reflection as a form of action. Definitely, if I had the sort of foreign person's understanding of English grammar, I would know what sort of, reflection is a doing word, I believe. Therefore, it is always a process of doing, but it is, yeah. So how do you then share that reflection with the world is part of the problem. Charlotte DeCann from the Dark Mountain Project says that if you're writing and never showing it to anyone, then you're not really writing. Writing does at some point require a reader, even if it's just another version of yourself in the future, perhaps. That's sort of the journalistic form of diary writing. But yeah, writing, I sort of also, I worked on my PhD with Professor John Hall, who was a professor of performance writing at Dartington, and sort of with Caroline Bergvall and a bunch of other sort of writers who also performed their work. They generated this new sort of subgenre of practice called performance writing, which was, the shorthand way of describing it is how do you account for the breath in your writing? If you're printing words on a page, how do you account for space? So it's just a consideration of performance in its relation to time, and I'm really not doing John Hall any justice here, so I'm going to stop on that. Before we, I don't want to miss the opportunity to offer an invitation to everyone who came this evening to get in touch with me if you're interested in joining Bibliotherapy for the Quarantine for Strata 2. I have no idea what form it might take yet, but I have been working with some people through my Back Lane West residency who've sent me some short films shot in isolation of readings. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat room. And if you're interested in joining me for some sort of bibliotherapy for quarantine in any future version of our existences, I'd be happy to hear from you.
Great. I just wanted to read out a few of the comments that have been coming through. So we have, to come back to a previous question, art doesn't need to be beautiful, kind, or liked. Art can be uncomfortable, confrontational, and yes, definitely support individuals to question their relationship and responsibilities with nature. We've also got a quote, Laurel Richardson, writing as thinking.
I like Bridget Kennedy's point, do we need to adjust our attitude towards the notion of productivity? I think that's a glorious thing. It's a glorious idea. That perpetual, slightly toxic phrase you encounter at private use in the art world, less so these days because there aren't any. But that sort of, the phrase, I'm really good, I'm really busy. Yeah. Sort of the busyness being a sort of, you know, a humble brag about how productive you're being, and sort of, yeah, so it's reflection, production, so it's built on that notion of reflection is a productive act, but it isn't production of stuff. It's sort of, go on, yeah.
Definitely. So we have a comment from Karen House saying this time in lockdown has been a valuable time of reflection that can change the course of the Anthropocene. Artists and what they do are therefore essential now, which I really like in the context of a recent article, I can't remember who it was with, that listed artists as the top one most useless job.
Yeah, the infographic in the Telegraph.
Yeah, exactly. Which we should arrange a whole separate symposium in order to combat that attitude. Here's another question. Do we need to adjust our attitude towards the notion of productivity? Oh no, sorry, we've covered that one. Where is it? Here. As we think about the way the creative industries can emerge from this current crisis, I'm interested in thinking about what kind of art the public is going to want to consume. Are people going to want to engage deeply in the social and environmental problems which have been exposed, or are they going to want escapism?
Well, I think, I mean, that yes, it'd probably be split. People might want each of those things at different times, and maybe there's different strands or sources that would supply those sorts of things that make you think more and things that make you switch off. So, you know, you can absolutely understand that people need a bit of a break and probably want to do different things, but also I think for a lot of people they have spent a lot of time reconsidering what's important and how they spend their time, where they spend the time, who with, they have any funds, how they're spending those funds. So, you know, I think yes, I think there's going to be both of those things will be needed.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, in the first part of the question, the notion what kind of art are the public going to want to consume is, I think, as my part in wanting to be involved in Culture Declares Emergency is to attempt to move the general audience of the art world from consumer to producer, and how that sort of would affect our entire sort of foundation of communities and civilization really is sort of really significant. I don't know, sort of there's a notion in sort of Nordic art schools that we're sort of, artists should be moving from being that sort of faux individual idol artist to a collective producer role almost, of someone who brings together people who then make things in the world that are culture and knowledge simultaneously, and therefore the art world becomes more producer orientated than consumer, perhaps. I think that's sort of what Alistair, ex-Grisdale Alistair up at the Manchester Museum is trying to do. Someone else knows Alistair's surname.
I know it, what is it?
Yeah, me too. It's one of those things. I'm sure someone knows it.
Yeah,
It'll
come through in the chat, hopefully.
Yeah, come on, who knows Alistair's surname?
Alistair Hudson.
Yeah, yes.
Here we go.
Is trying to transition the museum to a sort of productive space rather than a consumptive one, which I think is really interesting and useful. And that's sort of Grisdale's model of rural community art space as well.
So
really useful.
I'm just looking at a really interesting thing, a word I've not come across, symbiocene, Gillian McFarlane.
So symbiocene was coined by Glenn Albright, who also coined the term Anthropocene. And it's kind of, if we're looking at the past, and this is a huge debate, what period of time the Anthropocene actually covers, as the human impact on the earth as a kind of geological epoch, then the Symbiocene is a more positive look to the future of what kind of culture we should be fostering, which is a more symbiotic culture of, you know, humans being part of a wider system, and that being totally interconnected. And you know, a lot of this kind of thinking came up in this morning session as well. So if anyone's interested in that, please do. And you missed this morning, so please do watch that presentation. There's a nice comment here from Chris Greenwood. If this is the last decade in which humanity can change our societies, economies, and political systems to avoid climate catastrophe, we need to think about both the ethics of all this as well as the ethics. The aesthetics.
I think he's corrected later.
Yeah, the aesthetics. And being consumers is one thing, but what about being citizens?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the being good ancestors sort of refrain from Extinction Rebellion as well, isn't it? Sort of who are we being for? And that sort of technology's got a really interesting role in perpetually thrusting us into the very present moment. And always considering the ego, me inside the self, and sort of, I do think a bit of digital detox would do us all the world of good to re-engage us in more than just the present moment, and how the present moment has a past as well as a future.
So we have 3 more minutes. I'll just share one more comment from Alex Murden. Leisure time, escapist time, as the time of absence of responsibility and the time of play, has parallels with the processes of art as play and a subversion of everyday experience. This is an opportunity to intervene in favour of the sustainable. And I think that segues really nicely into what I would like to ask of all of our participants, which is to think about how we can be more empowered to have agency, to make art in a sustainable way, to use digital platforms in a sustainable way. So if anyone has any resources that they're able to share or links, to please post them in the chat. And then finally to ask if you would kindly share any reflections on this session and how it's worked for you. That would be really interesting to us as well.
Yeah, I'd really appreciate that, because the interesting thing about attention to digital performance of any kind is I have no idea what that felt or looked like to any of you. So I have chucked my email address in the chat somewhere. And yeah, I'd be happy to have any feedback or queries or attacks or comments. That'd be great.
And a huge thank you to Bram and to Sara for this afternoon, for your thoughts and performance and art, and to Culture Declares for hosting us, Exeter, to ESI, to Field Notes, who I first engaged with the Unbounded project and was then introduced to Bram and Sara, and who helped in the early stages of the physical version of this event. So thank you, everyone. I don't know if I should be handing back to Heather now to wrap up.
Oh, unmute. Yeah, thank you so much, Misha. Thank you, Bram. Thank you, Sara, and Sarah Campbell as well. It's been a really, really interesting evening, really well attended, and thank you so much. So, still light outside. We can go and stretch our legs at any point and have a bit of evening. All right then. So,
I'm going to go to the beach.
And just to say, actually, whilst people are still here, that we have the next offer, I think it's the next offer, is on the 1st of July, which will be 11 o'clock in the morning, Wednesday 11, till 12:30, and that will be Reimagining the City Part 2 with contributions from Claire MacDonald, Zena Edwards, Tyrone Huggins, myself, and hopefully Bob Gilbert of the Ghost Trees. All right, so thank you so much, everybody. And we can save all the chat, and the recording will be available. We will let Misha and Sarah know so that they can send it out to you all as well. So you can keep that on your archives or listen again. All right, thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.